I'm Maya. There's my email address and my Twitter account. So essentially what I'd like to do is nest the conversation around gaming within the context of what makes STEM so dang hard and inaccessible for some learners. I put struggling learners instead of kids with disabilities because I really feel like there's an entire category of kids who struggle, and the reason they struggle could be different. It could be because of learning disability, it could be because of lack of access, it could be socioeconomics and poverty, but we essentially know is that there's a group of students that can be successful in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics with the right supports, but either they're not getting them, teachers just don't believe, they have the capacity for it, whatever it is, there's this category of kids, and I really want to consider that broadly rather than putting kids into little categories. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about the rationale for using technology and then use my data around video games to highlight that and then open it up for conversation because this is such a big topic that I just didn't know in which direction to go within it. But so that's where we are. And please stop me, even though there'll be room at the end to talk. All right. Oh, come on in. This is my mom. I invited her.
No kidding. Parking.
Oh, that's okay. It's new to Champaign. So essentially, we know that science in particular, I could have talked about math too, but I'm really going to focus on science at the moment, is difficult for a lot of reasons for children. One of them is just this general huge amount of vocabulary that's very abstract that kids are required to master in order to be successful. So there have been some studies that have shown that there's more new vocabulary in the science unit than in the foreign language unit, often cases. Oh, this is here. Do you want me to pause for a minute?
No, it's like it's going to take a few minutes to get it.
Okay.
Set up.
So essentially we have a lot of content covered rapidly. It's very abstract and it's very text-based. So you can imagine that for kids who aren't efficient readers, it's inaccessible. And then there is this whole the way that schools have interpreted the scientific method, which is very rigid. And so often what we have are these labs, and they're, step 1, do this, step 2, do that. And by the way, write everything down in your lab and turn it in exactly this particular way. And that leaves a lot of children confused and with not a real true understanding of the scientific method because they equate these labs with inquiry. So essentially what we have is a text-based environment which is not accessible to kids, and they're not successful, and they check out of math and science very early on in their careers. And the other piece is, if STEM is seen as a reading test, then they're not actually learning math and science, and they're not actually demonstrating their understanding of math and science. They are essentially taking a reading test every time they engage in science. So we have to kind of think about a broader way of thinking about teaching. So these are essentially the barriers. The barriers are related to access. Another big barrier are teachers' beliefs. Oftentimes, especially outside of the world of special education, teachers are not given a lot of strategies for how to work with diverse learners, English language learners, kids with disabilities, kids at risk for academic failure because of poverty. And we hear a lot of, if only they weren't so low, we could ... And I hear that all the time in my research. If only they weren't so low, rather than what could we do to a disabled environment in order to help kids be successful. So here are just a couple examples. Do you know who Matt Schneps is? Matt Schneps is the founder and director of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Cannot read. And I love using him as an example because he's exactly the type of learner we're talking about. He's got a learning disability, always has, and has to rely on technology and adaptations and and strategies to be successful. Now, it doesn't mean he can't be, because obviously he's demonstrated that he can, but he's had to develop his own unique way of accessing content. Now, he grew up at a time before the laws were required to provide a lot of services to kids. Now we have the law, but we don't necessarily have the expertise in the schools to support students like Matt. One that you'll probably be more familiar with is Temple Grandin, right? So she has autism and is a very successful professional and lecturer, but also this is another person that has had to navigate the world to create adaptations for herself. She did not have teachers to open the door for her. Now the problem is I go and I find these examples of unique individuals that have persevered the system. What we need to do is provide the opportunities so that these are not outliers. And the more we know about supporting kids with different needs, the more we create an environment where they are no longer outliers. So, right. So what? Many people with disabilities and other struggling learners can succeed, and there are strategies. So I'm going to provide a framework that I like to think about in terms of how to do it, and then we're going to just look at a couple examples. Okay. So when I think about strategies and technologies and teacher professional practice, this is essentially where we've been when I was learning to teach and when I first started teaching. We're teaching to this average, right? The myth of that average learner. And the strategies and technologies that I think about now are, how do I expand to the fringes? Because if I can meet the kids who need accelerated supports and the kids that need remedial supports right from the bat, I am expanding kind of the amount of kids that I'm meeting off the bat. So, the idea of the average learner, the myth of the average learner, there's a, what's his name? Last name is, oh Lord, what's his name? Doesn't matter. So I heard a lecture, and this person was saying that we don't have the myth of the average shoe size, right? So why don't we have a myth of the average shoe size? It's because we can see the differences between our feet. So you put me in a size 12 men's shoe and ask me to run a mile, I'm going to be disabled big time, right? But we know that our shoes are different because we can see that. Now when it comes to our brains and the way we learn, we don't see those differences. It's not a physical, obvious manifestation of learner variability.
Is it what we do with them, or is it that we don't see them, or is it what we do with them? Because it feels to me as though we say, oh yeah, there's this 2%. Let's have special classes for this 2%. And another class for this 2%. And then and gradually, what we really want to do is kind of sort into individual groups so that we can kind of target with, and we'll separate everybody out for based on their shoe size, if you will. We'll have all the size 12s in one room and all the size 10s in another, and we can give them the right shoes and them the right shoes, and then...
Yeah, as long as we don't end up saying, if you have a size 5, you have a disability, right? Or a size 13, and only the size 7, 8 are like the quote-unquote regular shoe sizes.
Yeah, it's sort of like a poor analogy simply because of the malleability of the mind versus your feet.
Right.
I mean, of course they grow with you as you grow, but yeah, and also that there are so many different areas in which a student can excel or be struggling. You might have one student who's in this 0.1% in lots of areas, but really struggling in other areas.
And the fact that we feel like we have to give it a label and a name is part of the problem. I mean, we know that there are certain children that, like Matt, he can't read, so he needs assistive technology to support that. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that his ability to learn is invalidated. So that's essentially kind of just the broad thought there. And it is an imperfect analogy, but it sets the stage for that. And it sets the stage for universal design for learning. Now, in my mind, a lot of what happens in UDL we know is good practice, but it's a really helpful framework when thinking about learning. So, comes from neuroscience, and it is an oversimplification when we talk about it. But essentially what it does is it acknowledges learner variability. We know that kids learn differently, and so we want to provide them those options for doing that. And the way that this, sorry, I wish there was a clicker, I could do this. It recognizes 3 different networks, right? So it talks about the recognition network, the strategic network, and the affective network. So in the recognition network, this is the what of learning, right? So I want to learn how to drive a car. That's the what. How we gather the facts and categories. Then there's the how, right? So I need to know to push on my signal and my brake and all of those. This is the how you perform a task. And then there's the why, right? This is the motivation piece. This is why somebody is motivated to learn to drive, right? I want to learn to drive so I can get to work every day or to wherever. So that essentially is where it all comes from. And when we think about that, and we think about the idea of providing multiple means of expressing what we know, actually I'll go back. You know, if we know that kids are going to learn the what differently, they're going to have different ways of getting that information, and they're going to be motivated in different ways. We think about education very differently right from the start, because I don't assume that there is that average way to do anything anymore. I think I need to really plan for variability right from the start. And so when that happens, I'm more flexible. I think about barriers. I think, okay, I'm going to have some kids who are going to be learning about X, Y, and Z. What are the things that are really difficult here, and how can I provide multiple means of providing that information to them? It maintains high expectations, so we're no longer thinking about curriculum for the other, although we're always going to have to do some modification for some learners. That amount of modification is reduced when you're automatically thinking like this. So you're still going to have to adapt some, but not as much. Oh, you can't see this very well. This is also an imperfect analogy, but I love analogies, right? So here's a Rubik's Cube. How many people love Rubik's Cubes? Yeah. Some of them, right? So this is a regular Rubik's Cube. For a lot of kids, this is inaccessible for lots of reasons, right? But let's take somebody with a visual impairment, right? Can't see the colors. So what we typically do with education is we say, all right, this is what everybody gets, but my student who's blind can't access this, so this has got Braille on it. So I'm going to create a whole other something for that student. And so all of a sudden I've planned doubly, and I've got my regular rubrics and my modified rubric for the other. And you've done double the work, right? But the idea is if we could think about, I don't know, can you see that at all?
Yeah.
There's some texture there.
Yeah.
If we can think about instruction in a way that meets a broader perspective, like I said, you're not going to meet all learners, but you're going to extend the fringes of that bell curve, then the teacher's doing less work at the end of the day. It's still more work to do this than it is to do this. But you're reaching more kids, and they're not experiencing failure the way that they do in traditional environments. So, I think that's my last analogy. I can't promise. So the first one, the what of learning, we think about multiple means of representation, options for how students acquire knowledge, right? When we think about technology now, we have so many ways of engaging kids in learning and providing them access to content. So I think I've got the textbook, but not all my kids are going to love to read. So I'm going to also have multimedia presentations. I'm going to have graphics. I'm going to have illustrations. Lots of different ways of presenting information. I have examples afterwards. And then there's expression, right? How are they going to demonstrate what they know? Is it taking a pencil and paper test? Some kids are great in that environment. Others really are not. So how are they going to express their understanding? Are we going to have some kind of problem-based scenarios where they can apply information in authentic contexts? Are we going to use more than paper and pencil and allow them to develop multimedia presentations and so forth? And then there's the engagement piece, right? So what's going to tap into their excitement for learning? Okay, so that's kind of the theoretical piece. Now, even though UDL, there's a big debate in the field about could you do universal design for learning without technology? And I don't really want to engage in that debate because I feel like we live in a world where technology is everywhere. So we shouldn't, that debate, we've gone past it, right, George? Like,
Yeah.
we're totally past that debate. You know?
You're done.
We're done with that. Can we just agree we live in a world where kids have these and that and everything? So let's not have that conversation anymore. Let's think, how do we actually use the technologies that we can to provide multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement? Hey, Tara. So here are just some simple examples, right? As a teacher ages ago, I would have to create a whole bunch of diagrams. We can just go to Merriam-Webster's dictionary and have another visual representation of really complex vocabulary that's abstract. So a solar panel is a great example, and a circuit is a great example, right? Because what we do is we say, oh, I have solar energy, and energy comes in. But kids have never touched a solar panel, but they also don't know what's on the inside. So we can actually think about providing them that context here. When it comes to learning about electricity and circuits, we give them a bunch of, we give them a bunch of diagrams and things that they look at, but it may not always have all of the explicit terminology. We'll talk about all of these, but they won't be tied to a visual representation. So having this as opposed to just providing a schematic diagram, because schematics are very abstract. Engineers use them. We need to teach kids how to use them. But somehow you have to move from the concrete to the abstract. So this is just one little example of how you could do that, and it's free. Videos, of course. I mean, absolutely. I won't show you here, but this is like one of my very favorite Fibonacci videos. It's so beautiful. And you can teach all about patterns, and you really engage kids in learning about, mathematics as a nature, and all of that conversation. You use video, you tap into their motivation. You're also providing that representation to them. And then expression, right? So let them draw, let them create video, let them collaborate with their peers, so that it's not just one way of expressing their understanding. Apps are another example. We're not going to go through a ton of apps because I really want to get to video games. But the thing about all of these is that you have to really evaluate them to see whether they're good for learning. So they're not, just because it's technology doesn't mean it's great for learning. So you have to really think about what you're introducing to children. Here are just some examples of some apps in science. I love this frog dissection one. Have you guys seen it? So a lot of kids have a hard time with dissection. Allowing them to go through a simulation before the actual lab is a real good way of providing that information to them. This one at the end has to do with language and sciences. That's really good. I could have put a ton of math ones up here too. But the idea is that it's not about just the technology, right? It's what you do with it as a teacher. It's about the pedagogy behind it. So I always worry when I talk about technology that I'm like, okay, now we got smart boards. Everybody's going to do just fine now. It's what you actually do with the technology that's going to make a difference for kids. All right, my favorite thing to talk about. Well, not my favorite thing. My favorite data to talk about, because those of you who know me know that I love data and numbers. There have been a lot of studies that looked at how kids learn with video games. And some of them say, yes, games are great for learning. And some of them say, we're not so sure about this. And so I wanted to really look at gaming in a more sophisticated manner. I used Filament Games because these games were developed through a Small Business Innovation Grant, SBIR grants for the U.S. Department of Ed, based on Universal Design for Learning. So these really do have, they're consistent with UDL, and they're tied to the content standards. And they used to be free, now they're not free, so you have to kind of haggle with them. So as new teachers, if you say, we'll give you the data, if it's like, it doesn't include student names, can we have it for free? You could haggle with them a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But why video games, right? Because kids play games. Like anybody who's been around youngsters and adolescents know that children engage in gameplay all the time. They're on computers all the time. They're on their, here doing gaming and, between Minecraft and MySim and the first-person shooter games, they're playing games, and so we really ought to capitalize this as a piece of instruction. Not to say that this is what we should do instead of other teaching, but we really want to think about how do we integrate gaming into learning, because that motivation piece, when we talked about UDL, it's in here. And if the games are good, they provide opportunities for kids to learn content in multiple ways, and they provide opportunities for kids to express their understanding. So it really is consistent with that framework. We know boys and girls play. They play different kinds of games sometimes, which we'll talk about when it comes to my finding, but we do know that they both play. Yeah, and they play a lot. What we know about gaming is that for kids who struggle, kids who are poor readers, kids with disabilities, kids who don't love traditional school, gaming is a really promising way to learn. Increases motivation. There's a lot of stuff around self-esteem and self-efficacy in learning and gaming. And skills are learned and maintained in this environment. So when we think about wanting kids to be able to generalize what they learn, we can argue that within a gaming environment that happens at least as well as some other teaching methods. But the data is inconsistent, and part of it is that some educational games are really bad. So we know commercial games and what makes them good and motivating. Often when it comes to educational games, we throw all of that out the window because we want it to be good for learning. And so we change up.
Is it that they want to cover content?
It's that
so
they
it
want
ends
to
up being school.
It ends up being school. And let me tell you an example of how I totally screwed this up once. I was working with a colleague of mine, and we took Civilization 4, right? Super engaging game. And we decided we're going to change this, and kids are going to learn about the American Revolution. And so we added a whole bunch of stuff into it and pop-ups and stuff with dates, and the kids hated it because it interrupted their flow. So we have to kind of think about how do we gamify something and still include content and make kids still like it. So it's a little bit more complicated than everything that's important is complicated, right? So I figure as long as I mention the complexity of it, we can grapple with that and at least start with that. All right, I love this graph. It doesn't mean much except for that kids like to learn through gaming. I took about 400 kids, and essentially the way we did this is my friend Matt and a bunch of colleagues of mine, because this is a big study. We looked at kids with disabilities, and then we took NAEP cut scores, so below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced readers, and we asked them, how do you prefer to learn about science? We had a bunch that had no opinion. We had a bunch of kids that liked to read. Now, if you look at this, these are the advanced readers. Advanced readers had a lower score here than, these are basic readers. These were kids with disabilities, and these are our kids who are below basic readers.
Why is lab so low?
Okay, here's my hypothesis for why lab's so low. And we ask kids this, but we don't have a full answer. I think this has to do with lab reports.
Oh,
I really,
that's what
and
they
Matt
said.
does too. We think this has to do with those dang lab reports that we make kids do. And we have some evidence of that, but not full evidence. This is where we say we have to look at this in more detail and really explore the complexity. The internet, our kids who are advanced readers like this more than our kids who are below basic and basic. But it just shows that if we have this, it's about 400 kids, we should at least explore how to use this within learning. Right? This is part of the rationale. So we know that kids can learn in this environment, and we know that kids really like it. So
how many kids are we talking about?
this is about 400 kids across several school districts in several states. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this really fun data that I've been playing with for almost a year now. It's almost done in terms of analysis. So Filament Games has a lot of different games across different content areas. I'm going to look at 3 different games. And I had 366 kids play all 3 games. So before this study, there were a bunch of those studies. Remember I told you some study says, yes, games are good for learning. Others said, no, they're not good for learning. But they never looked at kids across different games. And that's what essentially I wanted to do, because I think it's just a lot more complicated than we want to think about it. So, Cell Command is a game where you're in charge of the cell, and this is very close to one of those first-person shooter games. You've got your organelles as your platoon, and you're trying to navigate this, cellular environment. You Make Me Sick. It's my favorite one. What I love about this one, the purpose of this game is to make your host as sick as possible, as fast as possible. So you can either engineer your own. I know, right?
So you're the virus, or the bacteria?
You create the bug.
You
right?
create the bug. So you've got
That's
your,
great.
or you choose a known pathogen, right? So if you're a person who doesn't have as much knowledge, you can go to malaria or the flu or whatnot, or you can engineer your own pathogen, whether it's a bacteria or a virus. But then you have to know about your host too. So if your host is on antibiotics, you're not going to create a bacteria. Is it airborne or so forth? So you're given a lot of information about your host, and then you decide how to do this. And you go from the macro level to like inside the cellular biology level. So you see this thing kind of go through the system, and it's fairly accurate actually as you go deeper and deeper. Crazy Plant Shop. This one you create alien plant species. So you learn about Punnett squares that get more and more complex, and you just create these monster plants collaboratively. So essentially you've got all of these children playing all three games, and we wanted to look, I really wanted to look at gender, at reading ability, at disability, attitudes about science and science careers, and attitudes about video games. So these essentially are my independent variables, because there have been other studies that say girls and boys do differently on games, or they do the same, and some of it actually just shows that girls present as novice players, and as they gain more experience, they actually do as well as the boys. But nothing has actually looked at all of these together across different gaming conditions. So that's been my task for the past year. All right, so here are my research questions. Essentially, are there game-specific differences amongst those independent variables? Are there relationships between those variables and outcomes? And what demographic variables interact to compute to result in those? So I'm looking at these independent variables in isolation. I'm looking, is there a relationship between those? And what combination of variables result in differences amongst learners between each of the three games and as a group together? How am I doing? Because I want to talk as a group. So yeah, I'm totally good. We'll get through this. It was quasi-experimental. So we actually, in this, had control groups, but they're not presented in this data set. We had some problems with ceiling effects with our control groups too. So, research in schools is complicated and messy. So there's another study that came out that talks about the control versus experimental stuff, but we won't talk about it here. I got a question. No. The analysis was multi-level modeling, and we already said that these were our variables. And the results were insanely messy, like insanely messy, and I'll tell you why I think that is. It's one of those things where you look at results and you go, what the heck is going on here? So I'll tell you the easy stuff that wasn't messy, and then the messier stuff. Across all three games, there were certain variables that were consistently predicting of performance. How the kids, what they knew beforehand, so their pre-test scores, of course. Their reading ability across all three games made a difference. Even though these games were designed on Universal Design for Learning and we tried to minimize reading load, it still made a difference. Those kids who were poor readers didn't do as well. And then attitudes about science. Across all three, kids who didn't like science didn't do as well, which kind of makes sense. So that's the easy stuff. Not easy in terms of how we fix it, but
when we say didn't like science, we mean didn't like school science.
Didn't like school science, yeah. So these were middle schoolers, right? So it makes you think we need to get to them earlier than middle school because their attitudes about school science really makes a difference, even in this environment. Here's the complex piece, and this is what is the difference between how the same kids performed across different games. So Cell Command, remember that one was more of a first-person shooter type. There was an interaction between gender and attitudes about science and interest in STEM careers. So those girls that liked science and thought they were interested in science careers did better than those girls that didn't. And so gender was a variable here, not on its own, but when I combined it with attitude, it made a difference. And so then I'm wondering, is there something about this game that makes that happen? And this is where future studies need to happen. Is it because it's more of a quote-unquote boy game, which I hate that term, so I'm not really using it. I'm on camera saying it. It's more like of a traditional game that boys prefer to girls. I don't know. Disability made no difference at all, but reading did across all three. Crazy Plant Shop, this was the only game where disability made a difference, right? So you'd think that kids that have learning disabilities would have problems across all three games, but they didn't. They did in this one. There were no gender differences here. So gender was an absolute non-issue in here. Now, Crazy Plant Shop is one where there's this cascade effect, right? So the Punnett squares get more and more complicated as they design more complex plants. And so I'm thinking, and this is just hypothesis, right? Because of the cascade effect of increasing complexity, that could be what the problem is with Crazy Plant Shop. So what is it that I need to do ahead of time or within the game to support learning for kids who hit a wall in terms of the complexity and the abstract nature of this? In Cell Command and You Make Me Sick, there's a bunch of upfront stuff that you know. You have to know a bunch of stuff about organelles, but once you do, you can play the game, and it doesn't get more complex. In You Make Me Sick, you engineer your pathogen, or you pick one at the beginning, and you make all of these decisions right up front, but it doesn't get more complex. It stays at that level of complexity as compared to Crazy Plant Shop, which actually does increase in complexity. This is the one that gave me the biggest headache, because I love this game. I think You Make Me Sick is one of the most clever games out there, and every single variable that you could imagine was problematic here. Girls performed worse than boys. Attitudes about video games, people who liked video games did better than kids who didn't like video games, and these two didn't make a difference. There were interactions between gender and liking gaming. I mean, all of those things, and you go, why is this beautiful game showing all of these complex findings? And I don't have the answer to this. And I keep wondering, do girls don't like making people sick? But I'm like, oh, I hate generalizations related to gender. That's a terrible one, right? So I don't know. We have to actually really think more deeply about this. But the whole purpose of this, and this is the point of this study, is that it's so intuitive to think that kids are going to perform differently in different learning environments. And just like we say, we can't say that books are good for learning, right? We don't say that. But we say games are good for learning, or games are not good for learning.
Yeah.
We make these generalizations when it comes to technology that we don't do in other learning environments. Labs are good for learning or not. I mean, we don't say that, but across games, we do. So we really have to tease apart what is it about these environments that either are, if you think about universal design, provide that multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement, and how that interplays with a very complex set of student learning variables. That's kind of a big thing there. And it's a stupid aha, but it's not. It hasn't been said yet in the literature. And my hope with this was to be able to change the dialogue around technology and gaming, so we actually stop kidding ourselves and stop having that conversation about learning and gaming, and actually start thinking about what is it about these environments that are either good, quote unquote, for learning or not.
So you're saying that all the, what I want you to say is, is that the effective conversations are going to assume technology, games, these things are there.
Yeah.
And the question is how, not if.
Right. And as a teacher, what do you do with these, right? So you don't just put kids on computers and let them go and check your email, right? You actually have to engage. Remember when we talked at the beginning about that it's about the pedagogy, not about the technology so much? So what do you do as a teacher when you're engaging in gaming? What I'd love to be able to see teachers do is like a crazy punch up. Okay, everybody, pick your pathogen. And they're playing and they're engineering their pathogen. All right, everybody, let's stop. What did you pick? Why did you make these decisions? Why did you pick a bacteria instead of a virus? And then you have conversation amongst the kids. They're able to actually talk through this. Yeah.
Hey, Maya, did you take a look at any studies about just the desirability of different types of graphics and fonts and colors before selecting the games that you used? Because they were very, very different in terms of design.
There's a lot of literature around there, and we have looked at it, but it's also one of those things where there's such inconsistent findings there. So I look at Mayer's study with multimedia learning, and I think his stuff is really great, but he talks about, having extraneous information in the background makes it really hard to learn and focus. And then there are other things that talk about, rich multimedia environments, and there are other, like Matt Schnapp's actually is a really great example of somebody who studies this in terms of like how big the font size needs to be and what color and how much text actually needs to be on the page. So we looked at it, but there's no direct pathway. There's nothing that I can see that says this is the way it should be.
Did you look in the commercial gaming industry for the, just take learning out of it,
Yeah.
whether people actually find certain game environments pleasing or not, and how that affects because the data you're collecting across different people types is studied in that.
I haven't done a lot of that.
Are you talking now just the aesthetics of it or the content as well?
Both. So the way that the approach that you take in designing a game, like one game, the first-person shooter is all muted blues and dark, and whereas the Make Someone Sick was all yellows and reds and big, cartoon-headed characters, and those things can soil your results across demographics.
Absolutely. That's the whole point, right? Is that we need to get a lot more sophisticated in how we're looking at the actual components within each of the games. So then we're able to study those things in isolation and say, what is it about, this environment that is resulting in the, and you're right, going to the commercial video gaming literature, and there's a lot of it out there. And we're using it, but not as much as...
Just like healthy food versus well-marketed bad food.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So this was really just a way to start the conversation, because there has to be a lot more here.
Okay, I'm concerned about the 15.87% on either side of the normal curve that you don't address as struggling. And I want to blame it on the multivariate statisticians primarily, because when they do factor analysis to establish the theoretical frameworks for the basis for categorizing students, they only look at the factors which are past a certain criteria, like a Scree test or a Mini-Eigen test. But I think it's in your field. I want to ask a question. Do you go out beyond the significant factors to the tails to see where there's little bumps in the Scree plots? And because that's where the action is, really, for different students. And categorization should change, I think, based on that data.
I'll tell you what my strategy has been for those, and I essentially, on those tails, I look more at the tail of kids who really struggle. You're right, in terms of factor analysis, and the statistical models aren't going to capture what's happening on the fringes, and that's where single case analyses come in, and some of the qualitative analyses. Almost all of the work that I do is mixed methods. I just presented quantitative findings here, but we do a lot of single case work and qualitative work to see what happens there, because I can't capture it quantitatively. But it is really important, because it is where you find a lot, that variability informs you a lot in terms of how you see kids interacting in these types of environments. And sometimes it's through small usability studies, and sometimes it's through long-term observations and single-case methodology. Because the methods are wrong for that.
Do you agree that the methods that
I can
multivariate
categorize.
statisticians use, that the special ed researchers use may be fallible?
Methodologies are just that, right? So it depends on the question that I'm asking. For this question, which was, let's look across NAEP scores and yes, no, do they have a disability? This methodology works. But it certainly doesn't work when I want to look very specifically at how kids on the fringes of the curves interact. So depending on what my research question is, the methodology is going to shift. There's not one good methodology for anything. So I always tell my doc students that mixed methods, being able to work across methodologies is really important, because you're limiting yourself when you're just looking at one. Does that answer?
Yeah. Also, did you use the analysis of covariance in your quasi-design? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Like I said, it depends on what my question is. Sometimes I want that covariate is what, whether I can covariate out gender, disability, all of those, but I'm so interested in them that sometimes I covariate out pretest, right, because I want to see the growth from pretest. But. Other questions?
I don't have a question.
No, you go.
I just have an observation that you make me sick. Like, the reason, I had like a visceral reaction to the description, like try and make them like as quick as possible. And so I kind of wonder, like, if it were reframed in like the opposite criteria, like that was sort of the question. Like, well, if this was you make me better, I'm like, okay, I'm on board. Like, I don't want to see grossness.
Yeah. I think our game designers there were like, yeah, I know.
So I think, and then I was female, and you said I don't want to classify, maybe that's it. But then that was like, I know that I really,
Yeah.
and I'm female, and I wonder how much that's a factor. Grossness is not a goal.
Yeah, the gender piece of it is so interesting to me, right? Because it happens across all of STEM, where we're seeing gender differences. And I always talk about we don't want to have pink Legos happen, right? So girls didn't like Legos, and so they created these very simple, simplistic pink Legos, which weren't as difficult, weren't as motivating. So they're like, okay, this will be good for girls, So I want to study gender in a lot more depth, and I always worry about, are the implications of this? Somebody's going to take this and is going to genderify the sciences or genderify the gaming environment to dumb it down, which is essentially what pink Legos are. Sorry, like people are. They don't watch this.
I mean, you could easily do something like you modify that game to have a toggle switch, make me better or make me sick.
Yeah.
And,
I think the more choice we start building into this, right, because that's what UDL is all about, is about flexibility and choice. In the long run, having the ability to personalize this as much as possible. I just finished a study that was just published where we looked at kids as app designers, and we had them design paper prototypes for games. For an app around understanding circuits and electricity, and they all designed a game, and almost all of them had embedded as much opportunity for choice as possible. They wanted, like one of the funny ones are like, I want my own music from my iTunes store, because grown-ups have stupidest music in gaming. But they want to be able to personalize their space, and the more sophisticated technology gets, the easier, the more likely it is going to be for us to be able to do stuff like that.
I have a question about this, not related to the data that you presented. It's more related to the stuff you presented at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, so we talked about vocabulary as being really, there being lots of terms in science, but then you also said that just that there are other reasons that reading in science is hard, and I'm wondering, is it because there are different kinds of texts, like graphs and things that they have to make sense of, or what else is it about?
There's Scruggs and Master Pieri are two researchers that have done a lot around reading in the sciences. Part of it is just the abstract nature of how a lot of this is presented. Part of it is just the sheer amount of content that's presented. And the other part is kind of the vocabulary piece. And so there are strategies that we use across those. So if it's kind of the abstractness, it's how do we make something as concrete as possible, make sure kids understand it at the concrete level, and then move to abstract. We do that in math all the time, right? When it comes to vocabulary, there are other strategies. It's just kind of, reading is just such a barrier for so many different reasons that, these games have been about giving kids access to content. There's a whole other line of research about making kids better readers so that they can be successful in traditional schooling environments too. And so those have to really go hand in hand. So you provide these metacognitive strategies to bolster skills. At the same time, kids have to have access to content so that they don't fall further and further behind.
Yeah, the other thing that was interesting is that you were saying that the sort of rigid scientific I dislike the rigid scientific method.
I know, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But no.
Okay, good.
I agree with you. I dislike it, but my understanding is that the problem with having this rigid scientific method is not that it makes things too hard for kids. It actually makes things too easy for kids. So I was surprised to see that, and I was interested in that, like how, because I often think that, when you have these rigid sort of cookbook labs that kids do, they're not thinking. And so, but a lot of them actually really like it. I mean, when I've done it, those kinds of things with kids, they actually really like it because it's easy, but they're not thinking.
Yeah.
So
Simplistic, but not.
What happens with kids who are really disengaged from learning and who struggle, they often just copy off of somebody else or are very passive in these cookbook environments because either it's fear of getting it wrong because there's only one right answer and one right way of doing it. Sometimes the directions are really off in terms of, even though it's very explicit and direct, like you look at what do you do in step one and it's confusing. So there are a lot of reasons why that type of environment isn't good for a lot of groups of kids. And you're right, in terms of kind of sucking all the creativity out of inquiry, it does that too. But then having it be totally open as an inquiry activity is also really difficult for kids who struggle. So we think about scaffolding inquiry, so having opportunities for some of that step by step, but have it be, very clear and a little bit more open, so that it's not so cookbook-ish. It's just everything. It's just really complex. That's the part where I don't remember who said this, but they say there are tame problems and wicked problems, and we're in the business of trying to solve wicked problems. I don't remember who said that, but it's true because it's so complicated.
The thing that seems unfair is that the video game industry has the freedom to experiment with what people will do. You give somebody, a developer, a little bit of money, and there are no other constraints. See if you can spend this money to design something to cause somebody to spend their time doing something.
Yes.
And period.
Or a market.
Yeah. Now,
a sizable market. It's not universal necessarily.
Well, that's right, but it's also scalable. So the casual gaming industry has started to learn that you give very little money to all kinds of different types of people with no instruction at all, and God only knows what they'll create. And free cell would be a good example. I mean, the value of this experience is less than nominal. It's negative, but it's it consumes a lot of time. Okay, why? Why will people do this? Sit there and click on these cards over and over again. And so you were talking about why do people choose to engage in learning, and then all of the process that we've got to go through to try to figure out what an appropriate way to try to engage someone in learning is. And the video industry is out here just discovering all kinds of things about what people will spend their time doing, competing with what you're talking about.
Oh yeah, and they're out. It's not even a competition, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
what you're talking about, or why people will spend a lot of time doing a really repetitive, mindless task, where even if you were paying them to do that, they wouldn't want to do it, but they'll pay you to do it when it's a video game. There's been people looking into this, and the current kind of understanding of it is that video games simulate real life in a way that is infinitely more satisfying to us. When you are in like a Farmville game, you plant your crops, you get other people to water your crops, then you get your crops, and that's your reward. In real life, you can plant crops, and then something terrible like a drought or a hurricane can come in and destroy all of your crops. You had no control over that, but you aren't getting the reward for it. Whereas video games, there's always a set system, even if there's kind of random variables. Like a monster will sometimes drop this item and sometimes it won't, but if you kill it enough times, it will definitely drop one eventually.
That's right.
Real life doesn't work that way. And that's why people will pay to play video games, because they're more satisfied with the experience they're getting from that than the experience they're getting from what they could be doing with their time, which is actually planting crops or actually killing monsters. The analogy doesn't extend that far. But there's ways you can incorporate that into labs as well. I know some of the science labs I did in high school were very cut and dry, like measure the different amperages on different parts of the circuit, and we submitted lab reports like that. But there are other ones that were really interesting. There was a school-wide event they did for the start of my STEM group called the Barbie Bungee Jump.
I love the Barbie bungee jump.
So
Absolutely.
For everybody who doesn't know about it, everybody brought in a Barbie, and it was kind of embarrassing because the STEM was run by these two, one of the only two male teachers in my old girls' school. They assumed that we all had Barbies. But they didn't realize that none of us really had any. They had to go and get other things. I know our Barbie jump ended up happening with a water bottle because we didn't actually have a Barbie. But the idea is you get a bunch of groups together, and we were able to kind of select groups from any grades we wanted. So my group was me and a senior, who I was also a senior, and then two freshmen that we knew from the academic knowledge team. But we all went in together. You measure the tensile strength of like different rubber bands, like how much force will stretch a rubber band by how much. But you do that with the rubber bands in the lab, and then you go up to the top of the building. You decide how many rubber bands you need to attach to your Barbie so that she'll go all the way to the bottom of the building but not touch the ground. And the group that gets her the closest to the bottom of the ground without killing her by sliding her on the ground wins the Barbie bungee jump. So it was a situation where we actually were rewarded from our initial analysis of the rubber bands with the actual experience of seeing our Barbie jump. Not even like we didn't even think we were going to get a prize when we won, which we did. They didn't need to motivate us like that. We just really wanted to do it just to be able to see the actual reward of our effort of like watching our water bottle fall to the bottom. And they had like cameras at the bottom to see how close we'd gotten. It was a really fun experience, but we also learned a lot about rubber bands and kind of force and dynamics from that too. Especially
and
the
it's
freshmen.
gamified, right? I mean, it was a game. You didn't need that external. I mean, there was
Reward.
actually.
The
Yeah.
reward was into game itself.
And
the
it was-
activity.
It was also really rewarding because we were seniors working with the freshmen, and we'd done similar things before, so we kind of already knew everything about rubber bands, but they didn't. So they told us afterwards it was a really nice experience for them because we got to teach them about things we already knew from physics, but they also brought insight into the group that we didn't have. Like they thought of the best way of attaching our water bottle to our rubber bands, and they were the ones who took the most accurate measurements of like the stretch and force of the rubber bands. So.
The other thing that commercial games, I think they do a lot of things right. And you're right, part of it is how do you keep, because they want people to stay in the game, right? That's the thing, and then get the game and play it as much as possible. In an educational environment, our goals are a little bit different, but one of the things that they do that I think we could learn a lot from is in order to keep people in the game, I could be at a level and continuously not be able to move to level 2, and I'm stuck in this level, and that level of frustration is okay for a while, but at some point I'm just going to give up because I can't get to the next level. A lot of the commercial video games have a way to sense when that's happening, and without me as a player even knowing it, they make it just a tiny bit easier. They provide me that hint so that I can get to the next level. As a player, I don't even. Because they want you to keep playing, and they want you to like the game, and then when there are newer versions, they want you to buy those and to update. But there's something about this level of personalized learning and personalized gameplay that as we learn more from commercial video games, and as we think about how does that apply to learning in the content areas, there's a lot we can learn there because it's about flow and it's about motivation, and the learning happens because you're in the system and you're engaged.
And I think just from, teacher's perspective, I think doing like this, what she's talking about with Barbie Bun, that's really, really tough to design these kinds of activities, and also for the students to be engaged in the piece that you want them to be engaged in. So like, we did they had this last semester we did something where the students had to design a cane, and so they all had a different client that had different requirements, different height, weight, all these different things, and then they had to design a cane for their client, and then they got to build a prototype. Well, we didn't realize it, but there were some groups that just wanted to focus on the aesthetics, and that was one piece of it, but it ended up being like, inordinate amounts of time on the aesthetics, and then they never actually, tested whether or not, that it was going to hold the weight, or whether it was going to slip out from under them and do it. They never tested all these other things, and so I think, that's one thing I think about is like, even with the games, is like, you have to, you as an instructor, I mean, you have your objective, right? You have your learning objectives for these kids, and the more choices there are, maybe you're sort of like, I don't know, I mean, maybe I shouldn't be so like such a control freak as a teacher, but at some point
You're responsible for the content.
Right.
That goes to the first slides, where you were talking about when I was outside the curve somewhere. The relevancy of any of the data sets was completely and totally lost on me. I don't need to know in a video game whether or not the data sets are relevant. I'm already signed up, to go for it, right? And so, and I wonder if there's a way, as you talk about universal learning, universal design and learning, if we can develop a process through which a mutual contract between the student, the individual, and the data sets is established with purpose and agenda, mutual agenda, before we would put any rigid, because we're trapped. I mean, if you've got a goal of getting this person to understand, physics and tension on a rubber band on this day, the chances of that actually being workable with wherever these people are in their aesthetic pursuits or life goals, is next to nothing. Whereas the video game industry, if you want to buy it, it's about having options and letting you move around through those.
Yeah, and there has to be a balance, right? And that's, I think, what you're saying is that. We have to think about how do all these pieces fit together so that we're not completely disengaging learners, but we're still covering the content. I mean, kids at the end of the day need to learn when they're at school, and these are, we're saying, these are the standards that it's
The
done.
video game industry, though, can play a kind of long game. And when I think about the aesthetic thing, I always think about my daughter taking art classes when she was little. And my wife and I became frustrated after a couple of years when we just kept getting, she kept coming home with glue gun and sequin stuff that she was, another glue gun and we were kind of hoping for some drawing, and things like that. And the art teacher's approach was, when she's ready, she will move to whatever, when she's ready. And we're like, because you're paying these things. But as a parent, you can kind of do some justify. Well, for one thing, she was having a good time. She was relaxed. It helped her, enjoy time after school. It was a supportive environment. And in fact, after years, she was doing amazing drawing.
Excellent artist.
She was. She's terrific.
That's right.
She's like great. I mean, it did when it came in a gush. But if as a parent shelling out for glue gun and sequin stuff. You say, come on, you know. But you're a parent, so you're playing the long game, as it were, with your child. And when you're a teacher, you're playing the week by week, a year max, you know, with the kid to get these learning goals or whatever to cover that content. And it's just
Yeah, and that's where you said if you're going to be in school, you should be learning, right?
yeah.
No, there's no. I didn't sign up for that. I don't know why they forced me by law to go off to this classroom. I have no reason for this. You know, I don't. You know, to please my teacher was my sister's answer. She was in a different place. And I don't know what caused her to what. She's an attorney now, and she does everything you ask her to do. She is real serious about it too. But you know, had there been a choice, you know, I probably would have chosen to, you know. And then what you use your time doing. In other words, when I learned physics, I'm not sure we knew why I needed to know this thing at this time, other than the convenience of the delivery system itself. You know.
And to pass the test.
Yeah.
Well,
That may or may not open for you some doors.
yeah. Back then, I think the system was a little bit more liberal than it is today, from what I'm hearing.
It was certainly more flexible, but on the other hand, there was a lot. I don't love the accountability system that our education system is under now, but what I do know is that if you were a kid on the fringes, it was very easy to discount you back then, and now it
That's
isn't
true.
as much.
Yeah.
That's true.
So, that's,
Certainly.
you know.
Yes.
We are disaggregating data in ways we did not do before, I think, to
I
the shame
have
of the
one.
field.
Oh, you want to go?
It's okay. You could
Oh,
go.
wait.
Now we should.
Rock, paper,
Okay, I will
scissors.
say. I hear a lot about what we kind of pre-prepare in order to do it in the LA Universal Design. I don't hear enough about the other way, that we have to do more dialogue with the student in order to do what works for him and what we are trying to kind of pre-guess everything and come covered. I don't think that that's the best strategy. I think that putting more effort on dialogue with the student will get us further, or at least move a little bit of the balance towards this, and not expect to know everything and to cover everything before we are getting in. We meet the student.
Yeah.
We have to be, and that, from my experience, it makes many teachers very rigid, because they know that this is what they need to know to do in order to, and that should cover everything. And usually it doesn't. There is no such thing. And we do have, and we don't work enough on the dialogue and itself.
Yeah. The way I see it is, that's another thing where it's not an either or, right? We're kind of somewhere in the middle. What's happening a lot now is that there's a lesson plan that is then modified for individuals, and it's modified in ways that aren't as good. And so, if, in my mind, a teacher thinks from the very beginning, from the framework of having a more flexible lesson plan, but then you're still having to address individual student needs. Yeah, I don't know. I don't disagree with you. I just think that we want to expand kind of how teachers are engaging.
My daughter wanted to learn how to go up to school, so you would have. That was her
Shock
goal.
Mike.
That was
Is she a chemist or is she?
That's right.
Did we give her access to the data? or-
teacher meetings about that one.
Oh my.
I have one more methodological question. If you said you did a mixed methods design, how were your attitude questions developed? Were they based on observation? That's one part of it. Were they just shooting from the hip and thinking, or did they come from research? The other question is, could some multidimensional, multicollinearity be going on that sort of affected the data when you looked at the relationships?
The questions, the attitude questions were developed as a Likert scale through a Delphi process.
But the content of the item,
Yeah, those were developed through Delphi.
through a group of people, a group of researchers?
Yep, through a group of researchers. So we went through kind of the content and construct validity there. Those were quantitative, and then what we did is we took a sample of kids and we interviewed them, and we did, so that's where we got some of that qualitative data as well. There's always going to be confounding kind of methodology. We recognize that the confounding variable problem that we have, right? So as we report this to the, whatever 0.01 certainty or 0.05, I guess I can't completely do away with that error. We just have to report it as a limitation in the studies.
Because you can have monstrous correlations come about for no reason if you have two variables that are highly related.
Yeah.
It
You
affects
hope
the
that
other
your
variable.
analysis catches that. I mean,
Yeah.
you do. I mean, doing my power analysis and doing my, you can never, right, the whole idea of type 1 and type 2 errors, you can't get away from. So you just report it and hope that you're not making those kinds of errors and that your analysis is able to capture true significance. But it's a problem. I mean, that's the problem with quantitative research in general, is that we do tests to try to make sure that we have a standard curve, rather than just assume that. And then when we get a result at a 0.05 or 0.01 confidence, we hope that we're actually reporting something that's a true significance rather than an error. But there is that percentage chance. And that's why you need to have multiple studies, right? So that mine isn't the only one. I'd love to have somebody else do a similar study and replicate it to see, are we going to see similar things? Because that's,
Like, since the commercial gaming industry is so successful, is there a way to connect those people with the education people, somehow combine them and make them design games instead of so many knowledge of how to engage people, and then educators have know how to what they should teach, and then if there's a way to combine those two groups together, would that be
that would be ideal. I think that's a direction we have to go in. I don't know whether their commercial gamers have a lot of ambition to do that, given kind of what we've done to educational video games. We're not seen as as very good collaborators in that world because. But Minecraft's great.
It's seen and I don't know.
And there's Minecraft, there's
Minecraft
EDU.
players
Yeah.
here, but
So Minecraft is sold kind of as is, but it's the modding community for it's very open. The game designers make it very easy for players to modify.
Yes.
When you modify the game's content to change it, it's
Uh-huh.
called a mod. Mod it in different ways.
by the way.
Yeah. So part of the problem you're going to have trying to contact commercial industries is if there's no market for making money from it, they're probably not going to agree to do it.
Yeah, but they love it when you mod their games.
Yeah, well, some do, some don't.
They say they don't, but they really do.
Minecraft does. Some companies are very kind of controlling, and they don't want people to change their game. But there's a lot of other companies that are very happy when people mod their games, and that's the kind of smartest approach to take. Is that when people are capable of modding your game, they're adding new content, which means people will play your game longer, which means more people are likely to buy your game.
So you just hit on something super important that when Jim G was in town, he talked about this. So in terms of these commercial games, what people are learning in these environments are one thing, but then there's this whole community outside of them called affinity groups, where I want to be able to modify this to make it do X, Y, and Z. And there's an entire community where kids and adults get together and share knowledge, and that influences how they mod a game or how they play within the game. In the educational gaming environment, all we have is the game. We don't at all capitalize on the place where in commercial games so much of the learning takes place, which is in these affinity groups outside. And that's a huge, huge point that you just made, that that we've completely missed the boat on so far?
My favorite, because I play games a lot, my favorite games are the ones that people have modded, and I've done a little bit of it myself. And Minecraft is a very interesting kind of scenario because most mods don't end up being educational. But in Minecraft, because it's all around building, a lot of the really best mods are educational. One of the biggest ones is in the actual game, there are these things called redstone circuits, which are basically logic circuits that you build like on the actual ground. You place this circuit path, and you can place different like repeaters and little light bulbs and other things like that. And people have extensively modded that to make it a more kind of comprehensive system. And people have built calculators in Minecraft. Gigantic, like if like one block is a meter squared, they're like acres and acres are taken up just by this one calculator. But kids and a lot of kids who do play Minecraft come into computer science terms and like the computer architecture courses, knowing a lot about logic circuits. In the computer architecture course I've taken, most of the people who I was working with who actually understood logic circuits going in were the ones who had used like redstone circuits in Minecraft.
Were they predominantly white males?
I mean, most of the people in my classes are predominantly white males, but Minecraft is an extremely cheap game that can be played on almost any computer, so I don't think that it's only accessible by like certain demographics. It's a very accessible game in general. You just need a computer and $5 to pay for the game. And then people who've sold the game have also said, if you can't pay for it, pirate it and pay me later, because I want you to be able to play the game.
And I think more girls play Minecraft than some of the other commercial games too. I think that because it kind of both modes, the creative mode.
Yeah, there's creative mode where you can just have infinite resources. You can build any blocks that you want. There's like hardcore mode where there's a lot of monsters and the entire point is surviving. And then there's like the mode I play, which is peaceful. So you don't have infinite resources. You still have to go like collect things, but there's nothing that wants to kill you.
Right.
So it's much easier to just kind of casually play because you don't have to worry about dying and losing all of your items.
That's true.
And are there different communities around each of these?
I don't know. I would say so because I know there's mods that only work in creative mode, and I know there's mods that only work in like survival mode. And then there's also kind of the community aspect. Like I play a lot of single player, but a lot of people also play a bunch of multiplayer where it's like a bunch of people are working on the same project as opposed to just me building the entire thing myself.
And the kids will go and they create their own mods, which is one of the coolest thing ever in Minecraft.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's all Java-based coding, which is what a lot of people learn as their first programming language, and it's not easy. But they want to do it because it's rewarding because once you're finished with the mod, you can show it to your friends like this is something I made.
And these YouTube videos and everything that's out there to help people learn. I mean, that's what I watch kids do. Because I've got a 6th grader, and these kids will get together and they will try something out, and then they won't know how to do it, and then they'll look for something on YouTube, and it'll show them how to do it. And that's the part where you totally missed the boat.
I mean, and that's what you really want in that cane,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Exactly.
So you have the aesthetics, but then you see what others are doing, and you say, oh, well, this is really cool. Why is it cool? Maybe it's cool because it just looks better. I mean, and maybe that is the thing with cane design. Or maybe it's cool because it functions better, and it functions better for engineering reasons. And the peer, it seems like that's what we're kind of converging on, is how you leverage the peer educational capacity. Peer group educational class.
Well, I don't know. I mean, with the Barbie bungee jump, would you have been interested in it even if your peers were not?
I think I would have. I don't think I'm a very representative sample because the school I went to did kind of foster individuality. And we had very few problems with kind of peer pressure and events like that. I don't know that that's the case in a lot of other schools. But there was never even a question of whether or not my peers were going to be interested in it. Everybody in the school was interested in it. I mean, it was.
And upperclassmen were.
The upperclassmen were working with the freshmen. I mean, a lot of times it was like all of the juniors were like together and like nobody like split out, but there were a lot of groups that were kind of taken from across grades and things like that. So I don't know if that mindset was a product of like the school I went to, which was a single-sex school, and it's been said that that's easier for women to like science in
There's a
single-sex
lot of
schools.
evidence of that.
Or if it was just, a lot of my friends liked science, and I was friends with all the people who liked science, so nobody was in my friend group was going to be uninterested in it. We had a lot of people who didn't really like science who were super excited about the Barbie bungee jump. Who doesn't want to throw a doll off the roof?
I know, right?
Sufei, did you have another question?
Oh no, I was just gonna say actually some people around Google build like a mod for like Minecraft that actually teach quantum physics now, and it's like free very open. So it's, yeah.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Maria.
this was
This
fun.
was great.
Thank you for
Maybe,
being here and
so-
talking about gaming.